take with them their own contextual way of communicating Islam from Morocco to Spain or to the UK or to the Western countries. So they are very detached from the way Muslim youth that are Spanish or British or French understand Islam. So they communicate Islam in a way that is very detached to their own upbringing in European states. So I'm wondering if this new training kind of incorporates that or not, or yes, this is...
Okay, so for the training, the Institute does not train Moroccans who go to France or other countries outside of the kingdom as imams in the mosques. They actually train people who are imams or are willing to become imams from these specific countries, and they come to the country for that training. But it is still too soon to know if it's working. The Institute was created in 2015, and it's only 2019, where there's no data that can give us clear answers.
They still had to answer some of the questions.
It's related to this topic.
Okay, maybe.
This training is mandatory for the imams, or they can do it or not?
The Moroccan imams?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to become an imam, you have to go through the Institute. The selection process for the murshidat and the murshidin, especially the murshidat, is a little bit more tight, in a sense that it's very limited. You have very limited number of women who can have access to this. There has been a little bit more research on this case, on the case of women having access to the religious field, being able to be trained in this institute. But there is no clear, at least officially, there's no clear data that can show us how many people from each, how many imams, murshideen and murshidat train every year and where they go exactly. So I guess we just have to wait.
Thank you. Now Ibrahim, if you want to answer.
So if I understood your question, you were asking if I knew about de-radicalization or programs preventing the radicalization within schools. So it exists in France, and Moussa could say, I guess, like a lot about that. I don't know if it exists in Spain. I know that, okay. And there is some things done in the US too. The problem with those programs is that they're really tricky in the sense that you go into classrooms in which students are still forming their ideas. Are you trying to detect people who have radicalized or ideas deemed radicalized, and are you going to report kids to the police? And also, what message do you send to kids if the training is basically saying there is one way of seeing the world, and that's the right way to see the world? Because they have to develop their ideas by themselves. They have to exert, I think, more than anything, critical thinking. And one training that I saw that was interesting, it was not a training aiming at preventing radicalization. It was just training aiming at debunking fake news. And I really liked it because the person was not saying, don't go on the internet to get your information. I was saying, like, the media also get the information wrong from time to time, as does the internet. That's not just an internet problem. They were saying just check and check and check again your sources, and even when you have checked your sources and you're sure that something is true, it's still up for debate. You still have to be able to think that something that was reported in a certain way, after a year or two will be reported differently because new elements will come into the picture. So I think that if it's done at all, I think it has to be done through this angle and not through the angle of like preventing radicalization. If I could just answer a little bit on the comment about integration. I think it's an important point, and I think we do have to think about integration. I think some scholars in France did that recently. I have the book on my computer right now. It's called La Fabrique de la Radicalité, the fabric of radicality. And they went and interviewed, I think, 200 or 300 people who went to Syria to join ISIS at a point. and they saw that those people, what was the common thing in France between those people was not Islam or anything like that. It was that they grew up in areas in which they were the only Muslim family outside of Paris most of the time. And being in that area in which they were constantly reminded of the fact that they were completely different from everybody else led them to see French society in a particular way. They were like good students, they had good grades, etc. But the way they were treated by their classmates, by the professors, for Laurent Bonelli and Fabien Carré had a huge role in the development of that radicality to them. Just want to add a little thing. I do think, though, that we have to be careful about saying Muslims are not integrated. If you look at the work of Alain Gabon, for example, he argues that, on the contrary, Muslims in Western societies are really integrated, especially in the US. He says that they talk with different people, etc., like they're really part of society. But the problem is governments actively trying to disintegrate them by forbidding them from entering certain places. If you take the French space, that will be Muslim women wearing the hijab, not being able to access to some workspace, etc. That's it.
Thank you. If I may add, in most of European countries, they don't need to integrate because they are already citizens. So it's not about integration, I would say it's about coexistence. Or Musa, thank you.
Yeah, no, my comment is just to put the blame on Sonia, actually, who moderates this panel, because in 20 minutes you cannot explain everything. And I will just connect your general comment to this figure that we have put at the very beginning. So basically the point of my presentation, if Sonia was doing Spanish moderation, I would have been allowed more time, but she's more German today. But basically, the point is the following. I was trying to show in my presentation that TV programs focus on point 3, ideology. But as long as we do not understand that ideology becomes attractive to individuals because of grievances, and this is where maybe you could put what you call integration problems. I take Sonia's point. If you look at the work done by Olivier Roy is telling you that those who commit terrorist attacks do not belong to the first generation of migrants, nor the third. They belong to the second. And if they belong to the second, it's basically because they are taught that they are equal as citizens as everybody, and the reality with which they are faced afterwards is not this one. And this is what allows them to buy the idea that if they do not get a job, if they are called Moro or Bunyul or whatsoever, it is because there is a global war against Islam. So that was just the clarification.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Wait, please. You need to use the microphone. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks, everyone, for the presentations. Brahim, when you started your presentation, you said something that now sounds as interesting. You said that the NYUPD is one of the best police bodies that exist. Can you explain why is that? And how does that relate to your presentation?
Yes, are there more questions first? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I like that we've both been in Morocco. We've been a bit more like overall, and in the US. Very interesting, especially for me. It's a total new topic. I have a question for you, Musa. When you talked about the indicators, I totally understand that some of the indicators are completely silly. But I was wondering, what do you find some of the most relevant indicators when we talk about radicalization?
Yeah. Is there any third question in the room? Okay, then I'll give the floor back to the speakers. Ibrahim, do you want to start now?
So I say that it's perceived as one of the best police. No problem. Perceived as one of the best police departments in the world. Why? There is different factors. There is the sheer numbers of the NYPD. It's 36,000 officers on the ground in New York, not counting those allocated to traffic, and not counting those who only work in NYPD offices. So that's Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, called it the NYPD is my army. And he said it's the 7th army in the world. It was being a bit Moroccan on that particular point because it's the 76 in sheer numbers army of the world. Another point to explain it is the whole cultural mass of cultural products that surrounds the NYPD and make it looks like it's that police department that is practically flawless, that always managed to solve case. If you look at Law and Order, like the TV show Law and Order, for example, if you look at NYPD Blue, etc., like those are TV shows, but yeah, Blue Bloods. If you look at those TV shows, they put the NYPD under a really positive light, and you find that in literature too. And the last point is that in the 90s, in the 80s, New York was one of the most dangerous cities in the US. There was, I think, 2,500 murders a year in New York. And in the 90s, that dropped to, I think, 700 or 600, and now it's like 300. And so the policies that have been put in place by the NYPD of that time, the broken window policy, the zero tolerance policies, are seen as things that explain what happened in New York. A lot of scholars show that it's not necessarily the case, that criminology went down in many cities in the US, that the NYPD is also hiding some of those figures to constantly make the murder rate look lower. For example, by qualifying things that are not for sure suicides as suicides. So there is a lot to debunk here, but those are the reasons why it's seen as the best police department in the world.
So yeah, on the question related to the indicators, I will just put you one example. In France, in 2016, they developed some PVE programs. As part of the PVE effort, they decided for people who are in jail and who are Muslims to organize like specific meals at the time during the month of Ramadan, so that people can fast, and after the sunset, they can have their meal. They noticed that since they implemented the measure, there was a drop of 25% of people who asked for this option. Some people could be tempted to say that there is less radicalism within jails, but actually it's just that detainees are aware that they are being spied and monitored, so they try to abandon any kind of thing that would constitute an indicator of their radicalization. So as I said, if you take an indicator as such, it doesn't give you or prove anything. A combination of indicators, such as being isolated, adopting binary thinking, stop meeting with people, that could lead you to think that there is a process of radicalization. But to be honest, in my case, my recommendation is just to forget about indicators, because I think like overall it brings much more damage than actually positive consequences. Why? Because you think that at the policy cycle, you are going to design a program, you're going to establish a checklist of indicators, and then you need to train people at schools, in hospitals, in prisons, so that they are aware of it. You can repeat 10,000 times that an indicator as such does not have any value. In the practice, they will see things that until then were not problematic as becoming problematic. Meaning that if you develop a program, a PVE program or whatsoever, based on indicators, you have people, and those are real situations that I had here in Spain or in France, where people come from the prisons, and they say more and more people are asking for halal food. So I think there is a risk of radicalization. I eat halal myself. So you end putting the idea of civil servants, that things that were not problematic before, wearing the hijab, having a beard, and so on, are becoming now problematic. Because one guy in Pakistan or in Paris did a terrorist attack. And in the end, as it is a public policy is being always evaluated. So those people, they are under a sort of managerial pressure of trying to be positively evaluated. How do you do this? By underlining that you detected 100 cases of radicalization this year. So in the end, you end up with absurd cases. It was last year in the UK that a kid of 4 years was referred to the police because he said something like cucumber and they heard something like cock bomber or something like that. And those cases, or even in France, a kid drawing a knife and he's being referred, he's being interrogated for 8 hours. He was 7. So my question is, to which I do understand that you need to take action. You need to make people more aware of the fact that there is radicalization, and of course it's a problem. But the question is the how, and I don't think using indicators is relevant. In the end, it's trying to make concrete something that is completely abstract and that cannot lie on scientific evidence.
Thank you. I don't know if Nozen, do you want to add anything? Okay. Any last question? We would still have time. Sure.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. As a journalist, I wanted to ask you if you think that media may have some role in the radicalization process, or in terms of grievances, for example, or in the de-radicalization process.
Who wants to take the floor first?
Does it have to be constructive?
No.
Okay, so we'll start then. The role played by the media. Look at the way we dealt with the terrorist attack in New Zealand and look at the way we deal with jihadi terrorists. I think any journalist who does this profession should just sit on a table and take the two cases and look at how we deal with each case. When Anders Breivik committed a terrorist attack in 2012, the first 800 pieces in the news did not even mention the word terrorist. The first 800. When an Arab or a Muslim or un hombre de color commits a terrorist attack, commits an act of violence, you instinctively need to put a political content so that this appears as a terrorist attack. So I think this is the first point. The second point, when we deal with far-right terrorism, the media do the effort of distancing themselves or contextualizing what the terrorist is saying, because a terrorist attack is not an end per se. It's a mean to communicate to government, to actors, to terrify the population. Anytime you have a terrorist attack that is committed, I mean, look at what happened in Barcelona, look at Charlie, the media are just constantly repeating what was the pretext displayed by the terrorists, and there is no distance. People attacked in La Rambla because they wanted revenge on the Prophet. Okay, what does that mean? How do you communicate about terrorism committed by people who identify with a religion that is in a situation of minority in a country where there is not even the minimum of knowledge about this religion? And I think it's there. I mean, we are in Spain, and until today, anytime you have a terrorist attack, they talk about terrorismo islámico, not Islamista. Do we talk about Catholic terrorism or Jewish terrorism? I mean, and I think this is where the work should be done. Just looking at how do you deal with a terrorist attack committed by somebody who looks like you, being white or being Christian or an atheist or whatsoever, and how do you deal with somebody who maybe shares the same citizenship as you, but that you keep constantly depicting as somebody who comes from somewhere else, while he's coming from here.
Actually, the front page of 2 newspapers a few weeks ago about Christchurch, it was blonde boy who traveled and then went crazy, apparently, because he traveled to exotic places. But he was blonde, so he was not supposed to become a terrorist. Do you want to go ahead, Ibrahim?
Just one other thing that goes in the in with like what you just said. The propaganda used by terrorist organizations says that there is a war between Islam and the West, and that the West is aggressing, attacking the Muslim world, quote unquote. What we see in the media, the narrative we see in the media, and I talk about that in one of my papers about the war on terror that I call a discourse rather than a war, is that discourse of the war on terror is propagated by the media. It says the same thing, but with a different point of view, meaning Islam is at war with the West, or the Muslim world is at war with the West. And the problem is that doesn't allow for nuance, that creates binaries, and those binaries reinforce one another. So jumping from that to say that the media has a role in the radicalization process, I won't do that because I think that deserves way more research than that. But I think that, yes, definitely there is a link between those two narratives that are put out there by part of the media and by terrorist organizations.
And if I may add, I'm sorry because I'm not one of the panelists, but I teach security here in Barcelona. And I think one of the problems is probably that the concepts have been defined by white Westerns. Because when Christchurch, for example, in class, we tried to analyze why people were calling it like a hate attack or a hate crime and not terrorism. And the truth is that with the UN concepts in front of you, it's not so clear. It's very political to put the burden of where it's terrorism and where it's not, because you have to be part of an organization. There's like some conditions, and therefore, when it's someone, as Ibrahim was saying, or Musa, I think that you feel more like close to you because it was a white. In my case, it was a white person, right? Deciding what is a hate crime and what is terrorism. With the concepts in front, it's in the end a subjective decision. It's not like A or B. And I think probably we would have to reframe the concepts themselves, like what is a lonely wolf, what is terrorism, to widen it to not just West Eastern terrorism or whoever we want to put the label on. I think there was another question here. Okay, opinions are welcome too, if short. And
thank you all. Related to these points. No, this indicators, sorry. I think they are bad for the Muslim people because it increased like stigma and racism in the population. They give a misunderstanding point of what is Islam. So how can we avoid this kind of indicators in the public institutions?
May I just add to that as well? Sorry. I think one of the problems of the indicators is that comparing, for example, all those indicators to a normal Muslim are not extreme things. Those are things that we do on a day-to-day basis. You know, like if you have a beard or like you eat halal, those are just normal things. And so the problem comes where those who are doing the analysis or placing those indicators aren't aware of what is considered in their perception to be deviant or not, or what is accepted in Islamic scripture. And so a lot of the problem comes up to the interpretation of the so-called white person or person who's detached from the actual day-to-day life of Islam. So, yeah.
Just, I mean, how to do it, I think, and this is what I was teaching my students last week. If you take this into account, the distinction between ideas and behavior, and that you properly explain what is Islam on the one hand, on the other hand, what is Salafism, the non-violent branch, as a fundamentalist branch. And then if you lead policymakers, if you make them understand the fact that It's okay for somebody to be fundamentalist while he's not calling for hate crime. Maybe you can do actions that have to do with education, pedagogy, or whatsoever. But in the end, the limit or what we should be concerned with is security. We live in a society where many people think that white and non-white people are not equal. We live in this society. A lot of people share what Vox is saying every day, or far-right parties. But while these people do not act in a violent way for security reasons, I don't know whether it should be a concern or not. And I think that if you adopt this approach of distinguishing clearly what is idea, what is ideology, and what is religion, you can get to a way where people will only focus on the second of the two pyramids that I was showing before.
So I think we can close the floor so far. Thank you so much to the three of you. It has been very, very interesting. It should not be exceptional, but it still is to have three Arab academics or scholars, and I'm really happy that I moderated this session. And thank you for surviving to my coughing also. I apologize. I think we can now go out and then wait for the next session. Thank you very much.